Okay, great. We've got one more talk in this session. So Ben Hindman from Mesosphere is somewhere in China, I believe. And where I just looked it up, it's about almost 6:30 in the morning. So thanks for getting up early, Ben. And he is going to remotely tell us about what has been going on with Mesosphere. And I believe he's there at a Mesosphere users group or something like that, so maybe we'll hear about that too. See how it goes.
All right. Can folks hear me?
Yep.
You can hear me?
Yeah. And just so you know,
Okay.
nobody is checking their mail or anything like that. They're fully paying attention.
Shane?
Yep.
Who's there?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay, great. All right, I'm gonna start talking. I can't see any webcam, so it's sort of like speaking into the void, which should be fun. Okay, so fantastic. When I originally chatted with folks about the end of a project, this event, I was bummed, but unfortunately I'm at China right now because we're doing our first Mesos Con Asia, and it is about 6:30 in the morning, so yep, I'm glad to join and be able to present here. So real quick, I think I have about 15, 20 minutes. I'm going to be speaking about Apache Mesos and the evolution of cluster management in the industry. So to kick things off, this is really the cast of characters for Mesos, and I wanted to call this out originally. The AMP Lab was really a great home for us to create this project and go from there. So it was some of the most enjoyable years of my life was spending time with these folks, figuring out what ultimately became Mesos. Okay, so the problem from, I guess, 10,000 feet that we were really trying to solve, whoops, okay. The problem from 10,000 feet was that we were recognizing that the way for us to run, say, multiple instances of Hadoop, or something like Hadoop and MPI simultaneously on the same compute cluster. In our case, our clusters were not huge, but still was kind of a pain in the butt. It was both a pain from a management perspective as well as a pain from a performance perspective. And here's just a graphic I have that's showing the way that most people traditionally manage their distributed systems or their applications in their data centers is they kind of statically partition or carve up the data center into a bunch of different pieces, and then they just run each application using the machines that they've statically carved up for that application. And as I mentioned, basically that makes management of the data center a total pain in the butt. When certain machines fail, you got to go bring in new machines specifically for that application. If you want to be elastic with your application, it's hard to. And also in terms of the utilization that you get in your data center can be really, really low. I have here that the industry average is around 12 to 15%, which I actually think is quite generous compared to what we really see out in industry today. Okay, so the solution that we proposed was you solve all problems in computer science with a level of indirection, and that level of indirection was to introduce something that sat between all the machines you had in your data center and those distributed systems, those applications, those workloads that you were trying to run on top, and let that thing that you sat in between actually do the resource management and cluster management, so you could more efficiently take advantage of the resources, you could better deal with failures, yada, yada. And that thing that we built was Apache Mesos. And as you see here, this is showing that one of the benefits of introducing this level of indirection with Apache Mesos was we could run on the cloud as well as on bare metal. Okay, so as HY talked about earlier, really what we were seeing was that data centers or even clouds of virtual machines. All these machines was really the wrong abstraction layer for people to be thinking about how they want to operate their applications. And instead, if you just think of all these machines as one big computer, the data center computer, then you really need some software to help you run your applications on top of that data center computer. And really doing so, of course, as I mentioned, the management benefits, but the other really big benefits is performance and utilization. You can better take advantage of all the resources in the cluster, as well as you can drive up the utilization. And we've seen this time and time again from a bunch of the organizations that we've worked with, that they're really able to drive up the utilization very considerably in their environment. One of the things that I think is really interesting is, while I think at Berkeley, it was critical for us to write a research paper that was able to demonstrate the efficiency wins we could get from Mesos. In the industry, I would say that while a lot of people want to use the technology for that, at the end of the day, the big wins they're really getting is the agility that they get from being able to more easily manage the applications that they're actually running on top. And it's harder to quantify the value that organizations actually get from that, but at the end of the day, that qualitative win is really the critical one. Okay, so I guess I'll just do a quick check, make sure everyone can still hear me and we're good to go. And I'm not talking into a vacuum. Okay, I'll assume that I'll just keep going. One of the things that I think is really interesting about Berkeley and the lab is we tend to do work that I think can be very relevant to the industry. We tend to get very connected to the industry. It's one of the reasons why I first chose to go to Berkeley for grad school. And fortuitously, after we started doing this cluster management work, there were a lot of other trends that really were reinforcing on one another that helped bring cluster management into the limelight really in the industry. And those trends were really a couple things. Big data and analytics, as you've heard from Ali and HY about earlier today. Microservices, which I've got a slide I'll talk about in just a second. Containerization, containers, and of course cluster management. So what I think is really interesting here is that all these things are really snowballing on top of one another. And you'll see a lot of organizations that, they might just be doing microservices and that'll lead them to cluster management. Or they might just be doing big data and analytics and that'll lead them to cluster management. Or they'll be doing microservices and that'll lead them to containerization and that'll lead them to cluster management. And each of these things ultimately ends up causing organizations to use more and more of this technology. So microservices, pretty buzzwordy term today in the industry. At Twitter, when we first started doing microservices, we actually called it service-oriented architecture, SOA. I know, but now it's just sort of the standard thing that folks are calling it. And really the evolution that has really been happening from the application architecture perspective is organizations have been moving from these monolithic applications they're writing where they had all of the presentation layer, the logic layer, and the data layer into a single application through the N-tier model, most typically 3-tiered LAMP, presentation, logic, and data separated out, and now to this world, we kind of skipped SOA. SOA was somewhere in between there. It's really this world of microservices where I think the crux of SOA was really this message bus that all these different services were communicating with. And in microservices, there's less a message bus and there's more directly these services just communicating directly with one another. And the reason why this is a really important trend that we're seeing in the industry is because in the past, if you look at, say, monoliths or N-tier, 3-tier, there was a lot less things that operators actually had to manage in their data centers or in the cloud. Maybe they had one thing, the monolith. Maybe they had 3 things, but they were still, in many cases, packaging it up as a single thing that they deploy and operate in the cluster. And now they have hundreds of things, thousands of things. I spent a few years at Twitter, and at Twitter, I think the count of microservices was in the thousands just powering the Twitter application. And the trend here in the industry is interesting to see as we get into smaller and smaller units of computation, these microservices. Some organizations are getting to even smaller units of computation, which is serverless or Lambda, that are just effectively functions that people are executing somewhere in their clouds or in the data center. Big data and analytics is the other big reinforcing trend here. I will kind of be quick here because you've heard two previous talks about this. But from the Apache Mesos perspective, what's really critical here is that there's a fair amount of stuff happening to actually run a big data and analytics infrastructure. In most organizations, they need a handful of different tools to simultaneously be running to really achieve what they want. They might have something like an event queue or an event bus, say something like a Kafka. They'll be doing analytics with things like Spark. They'll have multiple kinds of distributed storage. They might have HDFS. They might have Cassandra. And then they've got their microservices, which are actually just trying to take advantage of this data, share the data, and do everything else. So the crux here really is that, again, more things that people need to manage and operate in their environment, and if we could simplify that in any way, it'd be a big win. And then finally, this last trend, containerization, which for those that are unfamiliar with containers, containers is this basic idea of the way that you package up your application is rather than packaging it up like a virtual machine where you have all the user code, libraries, the operating system, you just package up the user code and libraries that you need. And then you run this container using just a single operating system. There's no hypervisor. Not only is it a great way to package up the application, but launching the containers is exceptionally fast because there's no virtual machine that needs to get booted. There's no operating system that actually gets booted. And it requires far less resources because, again, there's no extra operating system that needs to get booted. Okay, so there I wanted to jump into just a quick selection of companies that started using the open source Apache Mesos project. From Berkeley, we had this really wonderful progression, really. We started, the first organization that really started to seriously consider using Mesos was Twitter. And Twitter effectively brought Mesos in-house to build out their private cloud, effectively. At MesosCon North America this year, the senior vice president of Twitter of engineering got on stage and talked about their largest Mesos cluster. They, of course, have many Mesos clusters, but their largest one, and they said it was north of 30,000 machines. It's a single cluster, 30,000 machines, and it was running, I think, 300,000 containers. So that's, that's a lot of stuff that's running across that cluster. And from experience when I was there, we dramatically drove up the utilization of the Twitter clusters. But I think the bigger thing that we really introduced was we made it so that on the first day, a new employee could build an application and actually get that application deployed in a production cluster and get the feel of what it actually takes to run that application. The second wave of companies that started using the technology was Apple and Netflix, HubSpot, PayPal, and Yelp. Companies, for the most part, from the Valley that were able to interact with Twitter through meetups and other events and start to use the technology at significant scale. Apple's one that, for those of you that use Siri on your phone, all of the Siri applications, all the Siri infrastructure runs on top of Mesos at Apple, which is really cool. And then sort of the next wave after that was actually after Mesosphere, the company was founded, which I'll talk about in just a second. And there we were, as you can see, it's getting into more of the financial companies and the telecoms. And then the third wave, companies continue to use it more and more. In fact, here at MesosCon China, both Adobe and Uber are speakers, which is pretty fun. More things about Mesos, and then a little bit about Mesosphere, and then I'll wrap it up. So Mesos continues to grow quite a bit. what I think is great is we've had a bunch of longtime users, but we still have a huge number of users that continue to use it, new users that are joining all the time. So 44% of the Mesos users is from the last 6 months, which is really impressive. And again, I think that's those reinforcing trends that I mentioned earlier. We've had 52 Mesos meetups around the world and 3 MesosCon conferences. I'm at one of them right now, MesosCon Asia. It's the first MesosCon Asia. It's one of Linux Foundation's first conferences, and it's really fun to be here. I'll talk about more of that in just a second. And the growth has been fantastic in terms of Mesos contributions. Between 2014 and 2015, 25%, and 2015 to this year, 130% of growth of contributions. So speaking of meetups and China, so we did a meetup in Beijing, and everyone said everything's bigger in China, and it really is. The meetup in Beijing we had was about 170 people, and that was fantastic. That's a pretty big meetup for U.S. standards. What I think was more impressive and more interesting is there basically has been a Mesos community that really started in China without us really doing much. On the right-hand side, you see a talk that was given by Duban. They're talking about a couple of their clusters there, 2 clusters, 5,000 CPUs, 5 terabytes of memory, and a bunch of the Mesos workloads that they've actually built on top, including a TensorFlow on top of Mesos. Between Duban, Dandan, China Telecom, China Mobile, China Unicom, this has been a pretty fun trip for me to see all these organizations that are actually using Mesos in production in pretty quiet ways. We didn't actually know a ton about the usage over here. So beyond just software companies, and I've mentioned now a few finance companies, telecoms, Mesos is actually being used across quite a bit of different organizations and industries, which is great. One of the goals of Mesos was, when we first set out to do it, was to make it easier to run things like big data and analytics workloads. Our test drivers to start were really Hadoop, MPI, and then Spark. We created Spark to really to exercise the idea of running a new big data framework alongside other frameworks on top of Mesos. And as you can see, most organizations that are doing it today are running quite a bit of big data. In fact, they're also running quite a bit of different kinds of workloads and applications at the same time. The majority is still containers, but it's great to see these other things running as well. So Mesos, when we first built it, was a pretty low-level component. And what we recognized at all the other organizations that started to pick it up as an open source piece was there was technology that had to be built alongside Mesos. So there was things like service discovery, networking components, load balancing, monitoring, a bunch of security, a bunch of other things that really we saw most organizations basically building around Mesos to make up a Mesos distribution. And so in the past, when we often talked about Mesos kind of being this thing where we had these frameworks that would run on top, things like Spark, things like Jenkins, things like Cassandra, what was really happening in most organizations was they were running these things on top, but they also were building out a lot of their own components to do things like networking, monitoring, security, service discovery, better user group management, in many cases a better UI and CLI. We decided that really what we needed to package all that stuff together and make another system that packaged up these things along with Mesos that also made it easy to run it on-prem, on AWS, on Azure. And that's what we set out to do with the DCOS. And DCOS stands for Data Center Operating System. And the idea being that if Mesos is sort of this kernel component, this resource management component, this scheduling component that a lot of organizations were using, we needed to provide all the other things that made up kind of the operating system side of it. In the same way that in the Linux world, there's Linux and then there's distributions of Linux like Red Hat, CentOS, Ubuntu, Debian, so forth and so on. So that's what we set out to do at Mesosphere. We founded Mesosphere in 2013, and like both Databricks and Alluxio, we're all in the Andreessen Horowitz family, and investments. So DCOS is an open source project along with Mesos. This has sort of been some of the organizations we've worked with over the years. I won't go into too many details about the company, but we're doing well. We raised our last Series C earlier this year, driven by Microsoft and Hewlett-Packard as strategic partners. Okay, so I just had one last real slide I wanted to capture because I think it's really fun. It's been really interesting to see this evolution in computing infrastructure in the industry, and I think what is really fun for me is this idea that as we've transitioned, we've moved from managing physical machines, and we went from physical machines to virtual machines, and we had to introduce the DevOps ideologies and ways of better managing the machines and the applications we were running on top of the machines. We iterated from that, and we tried other things like infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. And really where I see the industry moving more and more towards is this place where you care less about machines, you care less about managing those parts, and you care more just about running your applications, running your containers. And I think that Berkeley in 2009, when we first started looking at this, was definitely in the forefront of seeing this this change in the industry, and this opportunity for the industry to continue to evolve in this direction. So that's all I had, and thank you so much for letting me chat. I think I've used about my time.
Doing good.
Great.
All right, thanks a lot, Ben.